A sleek business jet lifts off from a quiet New England airport. 9 minutes later, a violent in-flight upset leaves one passenger dead. Early headlines blamed unexpected turbulence, but investigators soon discovered the accident had nothing to do with weather. The real cause was a chain of preventable mistakes. So, what really happened aboard November 300 Echo Romeo? It's just after 2 p.m. on Friday, March 3, 2023. The flight crew of the Bombardier Challenger 300 are preparing for their flight from Dillon Hopkins Airport in Keene, New Hampshire, back to Leesburg Executive in Leesburg, Virginia. The weather is pleasant for early spring, light north winds, temperature well above freezing, and a high cloud deck. A good day to fly, and to perform the walk-around. Today, the exterior inspection is the responsibility of the second-in-command, or SIC, the co-pilot. As he makes his way to the right side of the aircraft, an FBO employee makes an ice delivery. After loading the ice on board, the SIC finishes his pre-flight and heads to the cockpit to program the Flight Management System, or FMS. Around 3 p.m., the 3 passengers arrive and settle into the cabin for the hour-long flight back home. Soon after, the flight crew start the engines, run their before-taxi checklist, and make their way to runway 2. For this leg, the pilot in command, or PIC, is pilot flying, and the SIC is pilot monitoring. That means the PIC flies the airplane, while the SIC manages the radios, avionics, and autopilot. Keene is a non-towered field, so the SIC has to call the departure controller on his cell phone to get their IFR clearance. The controller issues an initial altitude of 6,000 feet and a void time of 3:35 p.m. They now have 13 minutes to take off, or their clearance is no longer valid. At 3:25, the SIC announces their departure on CTAF, and the PIC sets takeoff power. But as the airplane accelerates, the SIC notices the airspeed readout on his primary flight display, or PFD, is showing almost zero. He calls this out to the PIC, who then aborts the takeoff. Within seconds, the SIC realizes what likely caused the error. He probably forgot to remove the cover from the right side pitot tube. The cover keeps bugs and debris out of the tube when the aircraft is parked, but unless removed during the pre-flight, the pitot tube can't provide ram air to the second air data computer, which drives the right side PFD's airspeed. The PIC taxis onto taxiway Alpha and shuts down the left side engine so the SIC can jump out and take a look. The SIC was right. The orange cover is still on the pitot tube. After removing the cover, the SIC returns to the cockpit and admits to his mistake. After some back and forth, the crew decides to restart the left engine, taxi back to runway 2, and attempt a second takeoff. They now have 5 minutes until their clearance is void. As the SIC runs through the before takeoff checklist, he notices the flight director status on the PFD isn't showing the correct setting. It should read takeoff, takeoff, which means lateral and vertical guidance is set for takeoff, but instead it reads takeoff pitch. This means they won't be getting any vertical guidance on climb-out. The SIC also notices a cyan message on the crew alerting system, or CAS, rudder limiter fault. The rudder travel limiter reduces the rudder deflection as airspeed increases to avoid overstressing the vertical stabilizer. According to the aircraft's Quick Reference Handbook, or QRH, a rudder limiter fault is a minor failure that results in the loss of redundancy of the system, but it will continue to function. He brings it up to the PIC, who brushes it off as the reason for the flight director problem. The SIC asks the PIC if he wants to take off with the fault message, but the PIC tells him it's advisory only. Advisory messages indicate a loss of system redundancy that requires crew awareness and that action may be needed. After 2 failed attempts to clear it with the stall rudder limiter test, the crew decide to go ahead with the takeoff. They have 40 seconds until void time. At 3:35 on the dot, November 300 Echo Romeo rolls down runway 2 for the second time. The SIC calls out airspeeds alive and cross-checks 80 knots with the PIC. But now there's another problem. For some reason, the V-speed bugs are no longer displaying on the PFD, including V1, the takeoff decision speed, and VR, rotate speed. But remembering them from before, the SIC calls out V1 and rotate, passing through 116 knots. The PIC pulls back on the yoke, and the aircraft takes to the sky. Passing through 400 feet, the master caution chimes. On the CAS is a new message, Mach Trim Fail. This one is in yellow, meaning caution. Mach trim automatically adjusts for the aerodynamic changes as the wing approaches the speed of sound. Without it, pitch stability can decrease at high speed, which can quickly result in a loss of control in manual flight. Caution messages indicate serious system malfunctions that require immediate crew awareness, and that the crew needs to act when time and conditions permit. But November 300 Echo Romeo was nowhere near Mach 1, and this wasn't a great time to start troubleshooting. So the PIC calls for flaps up before making a left climbing turn on course. As they pass through 1,500 feet, the SIC checks in with Boston Center, who clears them up to flight level 230. The PIC turns on the autopilot and another caution message appears, AP Stab Trim Fail. This means the autopilot is unable to trim the horizontal stabilizer by adjusting the angle of incidence up or down. Seeing that, the SIC asks the PIC if he wants to go lower. The PIC says no and asks the SIC to get the checklist to work through the CAS alerts, although he doesn't specify which one. Passing through 180 knots, a third caution message pops up, AP holding nose down. Because the autopilot is not able to retrim the stabilizer, it has to use the elevator to maintain pitch. The message is alerting the crew that it's holding nose-down elevator force to do this. As the SIC browses his iPad for the checklist, the PIC disconnects the autopilot by activating the trim switch. This clears the two autopilot-related caution messages. But when the PIC engages the autopilot again, they reappear, prompting the SIC to suggest leaving the autopilot off. The PIC comments that the problem is caused by the V-speeds being deselected. The SIC stops his checklist search and begins programming the FMS with the V-speeds, but it doesn't fix the issue. After checking in with the next ATC sector and receiving clearance to flight level 320, the SIC selects what he believes is the most relevant checklist, 8 minutes after the PIC's initial request. The Quick Reference Card, or QRC, lists abbreviated procedures for time-critical problems. And there's only one entry for trim issues, primary stabilizer trim failure. As November 300 Echo Romeo passes over Amherst, Massachusetts, at 23,000 feet and 272 knots, the SIC runs the checklist. The first and only step in the QRC is to turn the stabilizer trim switch from PRI, that's the primary channel, to off. But when the SIC selects off, the autopilot immediately disconnects, causing the airplane to abruptly pitch up from 3 degrees nose up to 11 degrees in 1 second. The airplane surges upward at 3.8 Gs, forcing everyone down into their seats. A 185-pound person would suddenly feel like they weigh 700 pounds. The PIC then pushes forward on the yoke, now negative 2.3 Gs. Everything not strapped down flies toward the ceiling. Then the airplane pitches up again, over 20 degrees nose high and more than 4 Gs. The stall system activates, pushing the nose back down again. The PIC finally gets control of the airplane and requests the SIC to turn the stab trim back on. Moments later, one of the passengers in the cabin alerts the crew that another passenger had been seriously injured by the in-flight upset. The SIC heads to the cabin to provide first aid, then returns to the cockpit, informing the PIC of the medical emergency. They need to get on the ground immediately. The pilots alert ATC and divert to Bradley International, 20 miles away, and land 17 minutes later. At the crew's request, paramedics meet them on the ramp to transport the injured passenger to a hospital, but they succumb to their injuries later that day. As soon as the media picked up the story, reports of severe turbulence as the cause spread quickly. But as the NTSB began its investigation, this theory was quickly discarded. Instead, they found a chain of missteps that should have been broken long before November 300 Echo Romeo left the ground. They had no shortage of data to work with: a cockpit voice recorder, CVR, a flight data recorder, FDR, and interviews with the crew and passengers. There was one complication. The flight data recorder shut down after the airplane experienced more than 4 Gs. The Challenger 300 has a load limit of 2.6 Gs, and the system likely assumed the aircraft had crashed. But even with the data cut off, investigators have more than enough to understand what went wrong. One of the first things investigators looked into was the failure to remove the pitot tube cover, which set the accident sequence in motion. How did the SIC miss this important part of the walk-around? It's likely that the ice delivery distracted him from his pre-flight. But instead of using a method to mark his place in the checklist or simply starting over again, he missed this step in the procedure entirely. And according to company policy, the PIC was also supposed to perform a final last look walk-around, but didn't. This oversight not only resulted in the airspeed failure on takeoff, but it also triggered failures inside the aircraft's systems. When the two air data computers disagreed on airspeed by more than 20 knots for 5 seconds, the trim control unit was no longer confident that the airspeed data it was receiving was accurate. This in turn triggered the rudder limiter fault CAS message. It also flipped the confirmed Mach valid setting to false, deactivating both Mach trim and autopilot stabilizer trim. But the takeoff inhibit logic, designed to reduce pilot distraction, prevented the Mach trim fail message from appearing on the CAS until the aircraft reached 400 feet, and the AP stab trim fail message wasn't shown until the PIC engaged the autopilot. So before takeoff, all the pilots saw was the rudder limiter message. How would the crew have known that this advisory message actually indicated a deeper fault? Well, as it turns out, they didn't need to know. The QRH includes a go, no-go guide, a reference that lists which CAS messages prevent the aircraft from taking off. And a number of cyan advisory messages, including the rudder limiter fault, are no-go items. A quick call to the maintenance department would have told them the only way to clear the fault was to completely shut down and depower the aircraft. Basically a Control-Alt-Delete for the avionics. But in their statements to investigators, both pilots incorrectly claimed that advisory messages don't prohibit takeoffs. Their decision to continue with the takeoff was just one more link in the chain of errors. The next error link happened moments later when the crew elected to use the autopilot during the climb, despite the known trim issue. As soon as the airplane accelerated past the speed it was trimmed for, the autopilot had to add forward elevator input to maintain pitch. The faster they went, the more elevator input was needed. Each time the PIC disconnected the autopilot with the trim switch, he had to manually hold 25 pounds of forward pressure to maintain pitch before re-engaging it. During a normal climb, the horizontal stabilizer is trimmed close to 0 degrees or slightly nose down, and the elevator is near the neutral position. But during the accident flight, the trim was at 2.8 degrees nose up, and the autopilot was holding about 5 degrees of nose down elevator to counteract the trim. The autopilot was covering up a drastically out of trim condition. And when the pilots used the incorrect checklist to address the situation, they connected the final link in the accident chain. The SIC chose primary stabilizer trim failure because it was the only trim-related entry in the QRC, but that wasn't the issue. The actual failure, AP stab trim fail, had a dedicated checklist in the QRH, but not in the QRC. And that checklist includes critical warnings. An abrupt change in control force can occur when the autopilot disconnects, so the flight controls should be held firmly, the belt sign selected on, and passengers secured. It also advises not to re-engage the autopilot. The QRC checklist they used, primary stab trim fail, includes none of these warnings. And while the full QRH version includes follow-on steps, it doesn't mention the dangers of switching trim modes with the autopilot engaged. By following the incorrect checklist, the crew cut power to the autopilot elevator servo, releasing nose-down control forces and triggering the fatal upset. The PIC later reported he expected a pitch change, but the amount caught him off guard, and his control response created a severe pilot-induced oscillation. As the nose swung up, he responded with 90 to 120 pounds of nose-down force on the yoke, then a 20 to 70 pound pull nose up, followed by a 20 to 80 pound push nose down. The pitch up likely wasn't what caused the fatal injury. It pressed passengers into their seats, It was the violent pitch down that created over 2 negative Gs, enough to launch an unbelted passenger into the cabin ceiling. One question investigators needed to answer was why the fatally injured passenger wasn't wearing their seatbelt. According to the PIC, the seatbelt sign remained on for the entire flight, and it was his standard practice to never turn it off. The passengers flew frequently with this crew and likely expected this. As a result, deciding whether it was safe to unbuckle was up to them. Before the upset, there was no chime, no announcement, and no belt sign toggle from the crew. In an interview with one of the surviving passengers, he stated the upset occurred without any warning, and that it felt like the airplane was breaking apart and was unlike anything he had ever experienced in his years of flying. A seatbelt sign that never changes loses its meaning. It's up to the PIC to signal when passengers should be seated, especially if there's a chance of an in-flight upset. If the passengers had been instructed to sit and buckle up, it's likely no one would have been seriously injured. One of the contributing factors in this accident was poor crew resource management, CRM. CRM is the system pilots use to communicate clearly, manage workload, and make safe decisions together, especially under pressure. The CVR transcript shows that many of their interactions went against standard CRM procedures set by their company's General Operations Manual. For example, checklists either follow a do-verify model, where the pilot monitoring performs the task and then announces it aloud, or a challenge and response model, where the pilot monitoring calls out the left side item, the pilot flying responds, and the pilot monitoring verifies. But during the accident flight, the SIC muttered through checklists or didn't verbalize some items at all. During the rejected takeoff, the SIC should have called out abort, 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 but instead simply stated, "I don't have airspeed," leaving the PIC to make the call. Then, in the rush for the second takeoff, important checklist steps were skipped. Had it been performed correctly, they would have caught the missing V-speeds and may have thought twice about departing with a CAS message. The accident wasn't the result of just one decision or mistake, it was a breakdown in discipline, judgment, and airmanship. In their final report, the NTSB named 3 key failures as the probable causes of the accident. The flight crew's failure to remove the right side pitot probe cover, departing with a no-go advisory message, and selection of the incorrect non-normal checklist in flight resulted in fatal injuries to a passenger who wasn't wearing a seatbelt. They also cited the PIC's decision to continue the climb and use the autopilot during troubleshooting, the pilot-induced oscillations after autopilot disconnect, and breakdowns in crew resource management as contributing factors. The NTSB's report tells us what went wrong. The crew made several serious unchecked errors. But it also reveals something deeper: the challenges of managing a modern jet when things start going wrong. In a 2018 NASA report on complex airplane system failures, researchers described a scenario that 5 years later would play out almost exactly aboard November 300 Echo Romeo. They wrote that modern airplanes have more shared resources and are more interconnected, and that an air data sensor failure can lead to a degraded operational mode, resulting in increased complexity for pilots trying to understand the consequences. The more connected the systems, the harder it becomes to predict how a single fault will ripple through them. But surprisingly, NASA didn't call for deeper systems training. Instead, they offered a blunt conclusion. We believe pilots will be unable to anticipate how system failures affect airplane performance. Why? Because beneath the modern avionics are just computers, and computers think only in terms of systems and components. But pilots don't. We think about what a problem might mean for the flight. Can I take off? Can I land? A message like rudder limiter fault might not seem urgent. The system still works, right? But behind the scenes, it could just be one part of a larger problem already unfolding. That's why we have checklists and published procedures, to guide us through failures that aren't always obvious. But they only work if we recognize what's happening and choose the right checklist. To understand how well the crew had been prepared for these kinds of scenarios, the NTSB interviewed one of the instructors at the training center where the pilots had earned their Challenger 300 type rating just 5 months earlier. When asked if autopilot trim failures were covered, the instructor replied, "Never in initial. Recurrent, they may get something." Neither pilot recalled seeing that failure in training either, even though it was listed in the curriculum. That means pilots can earn a type rating and carry real passengers without fully understanding how some failures might play out in flight. And as November 300 Echo Romeo showed, just because you don't see something in training doesn't mean you won't face it in real life. So, how do we fix this? The truth is, we probably can't train for every complex scenario. That's why we need to bring discipline, sound judgment, and strong airmanship to every flight, day in, day out. And that's not easy. Had the crew delayed their departure to follow procedures correctly, they would have avoided the accident entirely. And that's a message we can all understand. Thanks for watching, and fly safe.